My name is Bill Chafe, William Henry Chafe. I am the Alice Mary Baldwin Professor of History at Duke University, now Emeritus. And I've been at Duke since 1971, which means I've been there for 51 and a half years. So I'd always been interested in history in high school, but the spark that really set me going in college was my interest in social relationships, issues of inequality in our society, especially involving issues of race and gender. I think it was probably my experience growing up. I lived in a segregated white neighborhood in Cambridge, working class neighborhood. It was 98% Catholic. But on one side, there were 15 blocks of all black people. On the other side, 15 blocks of all Puerto Rican and Italian people. But we all went to the same school. And I played with black and Italian kids every afternoon, but we never went into each other's houses. But I had the experience of growing up in a very much diverse community. Then I was very, very active in my church, the First Baptist Church of Cambridge, and our youth minister was someone who every Sunday night when I was in high school talked about the social gospel. What would Jesus do in this situation if faced with inequality, with discrimination, etc.? So I became very much convinced that I wanted to pursue those kinds of questions. I then was applying to college, got into Brown, Tufts, and Harvard, and wanted to go to Brown. But then my grandparents said, if you go to Harvard, we'll pay all the bills. So I went to Harvard and had a great time. Took a bunch of great classes with people like David Reisman and Paul Tillich, Talcott Parsons, and was continuing to be interested in history, major in history. And when I got to my senior year, I decided I wanted to write my senior thesis on W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the founder of the NAACP, who was the most extraordinary, charismatic, powerful black leader in all of 20th century America, but he was actually born in the 1860s. And that was an incredibly rich experience. And at that point, I was going to go to the graduate school in history. But then I got a Rockefeller Theological Fund fellowship, which was for me to have a year in seminary if I wanted to. And so I said, okay, I'll do that. And I went to Union Theological in New York because I wanted to go to New York, and had a great experience in New York, but decided very early I was not going to continue in the ministry because I was assistant minister at a Methodist church on Long Island, and the Board of Deacons said I could not talk about civil rights with my youth group in 1962-63. And I said, my goodness, I cannot be a minister in a church like that. And so I decided not to continue in seminary. I taught high school in a private school in New York for 2 years and loved it. And then said, no, I think I want to go to graduate school like I originally wanted to do it at Harvard. And I applied to Columbia because I wanted to stay in New York, and was very lucky to get in and get a good fellowship, and started to immediately do the kind of work I've been doing ever since, which is on social history, racial and gender equality, and that's what I've been doing, and that's how I came to be finally at Duke University in 1971. All my work has really been on the United States since World War II. I certainly spent a lot of time on the New Deal when I was in graduate school, but I was particularly interested in how World War II made a huge impact on both women and African Americans. And it really transformed the society and created the background and the foundation for what became both the women's movement of the 1960s and the civil rights movement of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And the impact of World War II was so extraordinary, and people like Eleanor Roosevelt was so critical in bringing black people into the black cabinet and the Roosevelt administration, and in encouraging agitation among both women and African Americans to create a greater equality, and that really seized my attention. I certainly was very deeply religious until probably after my year in seminary. I would say I am still a person of great faith in Jesus, but I am no longer someone who believes in a lot of the other aspects of religion. But I do think the church was enormously important in shaping my life. My wife and I met at a New England Baptist Youth Conference in Maine. She lived in the middle of the state of Massachusetts. I lived in Cambridge. We became good friends, and then a year later, we were double dating with friends who asked us to double date so that the two of them could go to a prom together, and that night we fell in love. And that was 54 years ago. I've been very active in social and political movements. So when I was in New York, on the west side of Manhattan, both as a student at Union Theological Seminary and then at Columbia, I was very involved in both civil rights politics and anti-Vietnam War politics. And even though I was in my middle 20s, I actually became someone who managed a congressional campaign around the issue of being an anti-war candidate. That made a huge difference in my life. And I have remained very committed to public affairs and issues of political dialogue about questions of social equality. When I came to Duke in 1971, I was already involved in teaching about both gender equality and racial equality. Duke already had, in the history department, 2 members of the department who were black. But we kept on working on those issues, and my department in particular was very supportive because my colleague from Texas, Larry Goodwin, and I started the oral history program. The whole focal point of the oral history program was to use interviews with black and white activists at different points in their lives who helped to shape and develop social movements for racial equality. And so that first year, as unbelievable as it may now sound, these two guys, 5 months out of graduate school, were able to raise $500,000 from the Rockefeller Foundation to start the oral history program, in which we're using oral histories with activists to understand the origins of the civil rights struggle and how it helped to create a movement for racial equality. And over the years, we kept on getting more and more money and more graduate students. We ended up graduating 38 PhDs, half black, half white. 28 of those 38 published their dissertations as books, and 16 of those 38 won National Book Awards because their work was so successful. So we really did a huge amount by zeroing in on oral history as a mechanism for understanding people's stories about how they became activists in the movement. And that was actually absolutely pivotal. Now, black faculty, we became very much committed to increasing the number of black faculty at Duke. I then became dean of the faculty. And we went we increased the number of black faculty by 150%, from 17 to 38. No, more than that, but it was 150%. And we increased the number of non-white students from 15% to 35%. It is now more than 50%. So we were able to make a huge difference in the composition of the student body, the faculty, and the direction of the university as a whole. People like Terry Sanford, who was president when we came, were very important there. So was Nan Cohane, who was president when I became dean. And she and I worked very closely together on those issues of changing the nature of the composition of the faculty and the student body. You know, when I was in graduate school, I wrote 2 published articles. One was on blacks and populism in Kansas. which is continuing my long-standing interest in Black history. Then I also used oral history for the first time and talked about the role of labor unions in Flint, Michigan, creating the automobile workers' strike. But my dissertation was on the changes that took place among women in America during the 20th century, and primarily after World War II. And that was my first book. And it was one of the first books in the whole line of women's history books that came out in the early 60s and 70s. Then when I came to Duke, I continued to work on women's history, but I started immediately to use oral history as a vehicle for understanding how the Civil Rights Revolution took place. And so the very first moment I was there, I started working on the Greensboro sit-ins and how the sit-ins, which started on February 1st, 1960, with 4 young men going to Woolworths to be served, then led the next day to 16, then 23, then 66, then 1,000 demonstrators, and then within 2 months led to demonstrations like that in Greensboro in 58 cities in 9 different states. And that was the beginning of my work focusing primarily on Black history. And so all my books have really been on the role of social movements in shaping the effort to create a greater equality in our society. The book that's coming out in June is really one that combines a lot of this stuff. It's on the Black freedom struggle since Reconstruction, and is heavily based upon the well over 1,000 oral history interviews that our students did with activists during the 20th century, as well as the work of groups like the NAACP, etc. But it's a book that covers a huge amount of ground, but is in some ways a culmination of the work that I've been doing all these years. I'm most proud of the book on civilities and civil rights, the Greensboro sit-ins, because that book really helped to shape historiography on civil rights and tell a story of history from the bottom up, not from the top down, from the bottom up. How do 4 first-year students at a Black college in Greensboro find the courage to do what they did? And the answer is, they went to a high school where they were taught by teachers who told them, as teachers, they had never ridden in the back of a bus. They had never allowed themselves to be denied service at a restaurant. And they basically were a model of activism and standing up for your rights. And that's how these students decided that they would become part of this new movement. And that new movement, of course, changed the country, at least partly. Well, I teach a course in the Civil Rights Movement, which I love. But I've been doing a new class the last 5 years called What Might Have Been, which is tantalizing. Because the question, what might have been, I look at 12 different moments since World War II, when if we'd taken the road not taken, our history would be dramatically different. So, for example, if FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, had stayed with Henry Wallace as his vice president, he already was vice president from 40 to 44, instead of replacing him with Harry Truman, we might not have had the Cold War, because Wallace was against the Cold War. And if he'd been president, he would not have gone the same direction perhaps that Truman went in. What would have happened if Jack Kennedy had not been assassinated? 1 month before he was killed, Jack Kennedy signed an executive order to withdraw all American troops from Vietnam by the end of 1965. At that point, there were 16,000 troops there. Johnson comes into office after Kennedy is killed, and we go from 16,000 to 550,000. What would have happened if Bobby Kennedy and Malcolm X had not been assassinated in '68 because they were focused on both ending the war in Vietnam and ending poverty, ending inequality. What difference that would have made? What would have happened if George W. Bush had not been elected president, which he really didn't get the popular vote in 2000, and Al Gore had been elected president. Al Gore was obsessed with Al-Qaeda, and he would never have gone into Iraq and Afghanistan for 18 years. So those questions are really very powerful, and they give us a real insight into how important critical moments are in history in changing or not changing the direction we're going in. So that course has been fun. My students love it. I love them. It's fun. The one experience that I think has taught me the most was when I took part in the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama in 1965. I was teaching in a private school in New York at that point in time, and was teaching about civil rights, and one of my colleagues said, if you care so much about this, why don't you join the movement in Alabama? So I said, okay, so I did. And we had a fantastic experience together. We were half black, half white, but all the way back from Montgomery, blacks and whites talked with each other about what they could and couldn't do together. And the ingredients of what then became Black Power were very visible during that period. And the importance of understanding why you would have a different perspective if you were white than if you were black. And so a year and a half before Black Power became an issue, I really had experienced the discussion of those issues. And I learned from that how important it was to be aware of both the differences and the similarities in our commitment. I think I was very aware of the degree to which my mother was a victim of not being treated as an equal. And she died when I was 18, and I was very close to her. So I think that to some extent my commitment to issues of gender equality and study of women's history goes back to that experience with her growing up. I think secondly that my experience growing up with as many of black friends as I had, and then being part of that experience in New York with the movement, with the militant student movement, and then going to Montgomery, that was pivotal too. So personal experience was definitely an ingredient, a very important ingredient in everything I've done, and remains so.